The adventure bit of the life cycle journey was cycling from the north of South America. So I started in Colombia, cycling down the length of the Andes, more or less, to the end of South America. And the environmental focus was biodiversity loss. So I've been really thinking for a long time about, well, how do you communicate this stuff in a way that engages and that really reaches people? And I'm not saying the only way to do it is to embed it in an adventure story, but I think it's our way to do it. So.
All right, everybody, and welcome back to the Transnatural Perspectives podcast. I'm your host, Josh Bennett, recording live here in Oslo, Norway. And in case you're new to the show or just don't know, this is the podcast where we put nature in focus as we communicate perspectives on society and culture across environments and landscapes. This little podcast is doing its little part to share the experiences of people who are attacking the issues of social, cultural, and ecological sustainability from all sides by way of their own unique positions in life. We're here to gather perspectives of those working with the environment, everyone from academics to artists, activists, and whoever else I can convince to join me here on the show, so that you and I and we and all of us together can start helping to create a more sustainable planet today. For all info about this show, you can follow us on social media, read the blog, or become a supporter via our Patreon, or simply visit transnaturalperspectives.com for all information about this podcast. And I just want to give a shout out real quick to all you listeners out there that are sharing the show around, sharing with your friends, sharing it via your social media. This is the best way that you can support the show, and I can really see that a lot of that was happening last episode, and it really is helping the show catch fire. So keep it up, everybody. Please go out there and share. And thanks, big shout out to all three of our Patreon supporters so far. It's a great start. Thanks for believing in the show, and thank you so much for adding value in this way. Now on to our very special guest today, somebody that I've been eager to get on the show for quite a while now. My former professor, my good old friend, and epic outdoor philosopher, Dr. Kate Rawles. So yes, that's right. Dr. Kate Rawles is an outdoor philosopher, writer, cyclist, and activist who's using her love for epic journeys to communicate on environmental issues in a way that engages wide audiences through her traveling slideshows and amazing books. Kate is a former university professor from the Northern United Kingdom who decided to leave academia to bring her message of environmental sustainability to the open road. Kate's experiential and immersive method of research and storytelling first resorted in The Carbon Cycle, a book that documents her 3 months long journey from the US-Mexico border to Anchorage, Alaska, which was released back in 2012. In 2016, Kate set off on her next big journey, biking from Costa Rica to the southernmost tip of South America on her handmade bamboo bike, this time to track biodiversity loss. Kate was kind enough to stop by the virtual studio just before the release of her new book, The Life Cycle, which will be out on Icon Books this spring. So everybody, grab your helmet and hop on the saddle, because we are about to ride out with outdoor philosopher and bike adventurer extraordinaire, Dr. Kate Rawles, about her worldwide biking adventures and the philosophies behind them, in which she calls Adventure Plus. Enjoy, everybody, and talk to you on the other side with some reflections. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm very excited today because in the virtual studio, we've got outdoor philosopher, epic bike journeyer, and author of The Carbon Cycle and the upcoming Life Cycle books, Kate Rawles, everybody. Welcome, Kate. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Josh. What a great introduction. It's really good to be here.
Just where are you right now? How are you doing over there?
Yeah, I'm as well as can be expected. Thank you. Under the circumstances, I mean, I guess like most of the world, I have cabin fever and would really like to go somewhere that isn't my house. But having said that, I live in a beautiful place. I have food. I live in a warm house. I have no reason to complain. So yeah, I'm absolutely fine.
Where are you in general, and like kind of how's the nature doing around there, and what's the landscape like? Just get a little feel for your surroundings real quick.
So I live in a small town called Ulverston, which is in the south of the Lake District, South Cumbria, and so northwest England, basically. Quite close to the coast, really close to some very beautiful mountains. Coniston Old Man would be my closest mountain, and Coniston Water would be my closest lake. So we're in the thick of winter here, obviously. We've got that strong easterly wind, bitterly cold, bit of snow on the hills, not so much as further east. Very beautiful, clear weather. It's good. It's good.
You're living in the same place where maybe I last saw you, actually. So you're still living in the same place because we go way back. Yes, long time ago, Kate, you were my environmental issues teacher when I was a master's student back there at the University of Cumbria in the Transcultural European Outdoor Studies program. And I have to say, that was a really cool class for me. Having you as a teacher, it made me feel it's okay and it's cool to be an activist and still do like academic work. So this was really nice. So
and that's
anyways.
a nice thing to hear, incidentally, because I think that's been my life challenge, is trying to combine being an academic with being an activist, with not always success. I would say I have actually left the University of Cumbria now, as you know, partly in order to become more of an activist and less of an academic.
Especially when you're talking a lot about outdoor education and outdoor life and leisure and all these types of things. Yeah, a lot of the time, the issues and the environmental stuff, this kind of goes to the wayside. Do you think the landscape has changed in any way when it comes to like awareness?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and there's a lot of aspects to that big outdoor world, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you just focus on, let's call it the world of adventure, I think there's some really exciting changes quite recently. So I've been really troubled by what you might call the old narrative adventure, where privileged, often white people go conquer something and put themselves entirely voluntary into a position of hardship and then conquer something and then come back and talk about it. And there's very, very rarely in that narrative any discussion about, well, privilege, number one, and number two, which is possibly my most kind of passionate interest in this, there's very rarely any discussion about the environmental impact of that adventure on the environments that people love to go and adventure in. And sometimes those impacts are big. I mean, for example, if you take the classic climb the highest mountain on every continent sort of type adventure, which people are still doing, there's a huge carbon footprint because usually people fly, of course, from mountain to mountain. So that's a massive carbon footprint. And ironically, that carbon footprint is contributing to climate change, which is, of course, impacting on mountain environments worse than perhaps any other environment on the planet for various reasons. So it's really troubled me that this world of adventure that I like to think in a small way I'm part of has been a very privileged world and has been a very conquering world in terms of its attitude towards nature, and has not always been very mindful in terms of its own environmental impact. And that's all of those things I think are really starting to change now. There's a huge upswelling of new narratives around nature, awareness of privilege, very much an awareness of environmental impact, and talking about adventure in different ways, so much less conquering and much more about immersion in nature, realizing that we're part of nature, and that's a fabulous thing, and a fabulous thing for an adventure to celebrate.
Adventure in the tradition, in kind of the traditional sense, like you mentioned, in this kind of like old English, like conquering the mountains, climbing all the peaks, all this. What do you think that these classic images of the adventure narrative have projected onto society that maybe wasn't so great all the time?
I think, it's a really good question. I think it's that it reinforces and reflects our dominant attitude in Western industrialized societies towards nature, and that it's something out there. It's not something that we're part of. It's out there. It's either something to be conquered and gotten out of the way and turned into farmland, or, turned into something, quotes, productive, or it's a set of resources that we can exploit. So nature is very instrumentalized in a lot of these kind of dominant narratives that we have around humans and nature. And I think the adventure world has often, not always, but often inadvertently reflected that and reinforced that. So the idea that you go into nature to conquer it and prove yourself is not putting value on nature directly. It's not acknowledging nature's intrinsic value. It's all about yourself, or perhaps conquering it for your country. So it's a very instrumentalizing rhetoric that, as I say, is part of a bigger backdrop. And that narrative of nature is only instrumentally valuable and out there and to be conquered, or a set of resources to be exploited, is hugely damaging, I think. I would argue it's one of the most important root causes of the whole suite of environmental crises that we're now ramming right up against. And until we challenge and change that rhetoric, I don't actually think we're going to tackle those crises. To paraphrase that overly paraphrased Einstein quote, you can't tackle a problem within the same mindset that created it. And the mindset of nature as a set of resources to be exploited or conquered is the mindset that's created the problem. So that we have to change.
You've been on a lot of these really epic journeys, and we're going to kind of get into them over our conversation here. But, I can just say right off the bat, one thing that I really love about the journeys that you're taking is it seems to me you're like putting them in a perspective where, for example, there's this common, classical adventure narrative of dominating the nature and conquering that we're talking about. But that's not really adventure's fault, right? That's just humans. We like to go around and just project all of our stuff onto the world, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And for the most part, because of privilege and because of the people that have had access to adventure, leisure time, all this kind of stuff throughout history, it's happened to be dominated, at least, in the past, like you said, by kind of like the people who were privileged at those points in time, I feel like your approach to adventure, or kind of like your view of adventure, is different. So could you just give us a little idea of like what your definition of adventure might be?
I don't know what my definition of adventure is, but it's definitely a different approach as soon as you get on a bicycle, right? So if you get on a bike and, well, let's step back a bit. I've never been particularly athletic. So the idea of me conquering anything is kind of laughable. So that's number one thing. Like, I was never athletic at school, and I sort of got into cycling as a way of commuting, and then gradually extended that to using the bicycle to go on journeys. So I'm coming at this as a non-athlete, but really that's discovered to their amazement that a non-athletic person can nevertheless jump on a bicycle and gradually go further and further and further. So it's like a huge opening up of opportunities and possibilities for me that came through the bicycle. And then on top of that, the bicycle as a way of traveling is almost the opposite of the conquering kind of metaphor, if you like, because it immerses you in the landscape in a completely different way. You're really in it, you smell it and you feel it. You feel the mountains through your legs. You can hear what's around you. You're not cut off as you are in a car or a bus or a train even. And it somehow encourages a different mindset, I think, from the conquering mindset. And okay, a lot of people that were conquering were doing it on foot, but still, there's something about the bicycle that, I don't know, normalizes you, or puts you in the landscape, opens you up to other people. I mean, and that's an amazing thing about a bicycle, especially if you turn up on your own as a woman with a heavily loaded touring bicycle. It's like this magic pass crossed with an open invitation to come and speak. Like you're surrounded by people constantly. Everybody will come and feel able to talk to you. It's a magic thing.
Wow. Like a unicorn, like coasting into towns around the world. Amazing.
Or like walking through town with a cute puppy on a lead, right? Everyone feels somehow enabled to come and say hello under those circumstances, and the bike does the same thing. So you're very immersed in the landscape, and you're very open to people. Like people see you as less privileged and definitely a little bit vulnerable. And I think that's a great conversation enhancer.
Amazing. Yeah. I can say, from when I first started to get to know you and then later on, like reading your book now, it sounded like so foreign and like amazing at the time. But now when I read it, I know what you're saying, because over that time, I've taken some really great bike journeys myself, like partly inspired by. And I feel like I know what you're saying. I've made that experience too, where you're biking for so long, for days and days and weeks. And I would start to identify much more with things like the sheep on the side of the road and the cows, and not really identifying with the people in the cars so much, because they're in these metal boxes that have nothing to do with us. They just want us to get out of the way, So it is kind of funny how you you integrate yourself into the landscape a bit more. I mean, a person on a bike, I don't usually mean any harm. I can't imagine. I don't know. So I was going through your website and, how you kind of turned just like adventure for the love of it. It seems like you turned it into more of a real mission. What is this Adventure Plus?
So Adventure Plus is I mean, number one, don't get me wrong, I love adventures, right? And I think there is a value in going on an adventure. You asked me earlier what it is, and I don't think there's one answer to that, but definitely adventures push you somewhat out of your comfort zone. They take you to somewhere new, whether that's intellectually or in terms of landscape or people or culture or whatever. It's a combination of different things that is expansive, that opens your mind and your experience, and that challenges you a little bit in some way. And it has some uncertainty about it too. I think not necessarily the notion of physical risk, but a question mark. Can I pull this off? Is this actually doable? What's this going to be like? I don't really know how this is going to be. So adventure is a combination of all of those things. And I think that's a hugely valuable thing for any of us to do for all sorts of reasons, if we can do it in a low impact way, obviously. But Adventure Plus is the idea of using adventures in various ways to help raise awareness and inspire action on some of our most urgent environmental issues. And that idea has arisen partly as a result of inspiration from a guy called Bill Plotkin, who you may well know. He's a North American environmental writer and activist. And what Plotkin says, it's such a simple thing, but it's been such a powerful expression for me. He says somewhere in one of his books that if you can find the intersection between something that you love doing and are passionate about and something that the world actually needs, then that sweet spot in the middle is where you'll not only be happy, but you'll also be your most effective. And I really, really loved that, because for a long time I didn't quite fit in academia. I don't know whether you were aware of that when I was your lecturer, but I was a bit of a square peg in a round hole in the university system, passionate about what I was teaching and passionate about the issues, but really rubbing up against the system and the bureaucracy and the constraints. And so the idea that maybe I could carry on doing environmental work of some kind or another, but doing it in a way that made me feel alive and that I loved, by riding my bike in mountains, and that would still be worth doing. In fact, I would be able to be more effective as an environmentalist. That was such a powerful and liberating idea. And so that was kind of where the idea of Adventure Plus gradually over the years emerged from. Adventure Plus is my sweet spot. It's where something I love doing, riding my bike in mountains or having other kinds of adventures, intersects with something the world actually needs, which is definitely a lot more awareness and action in relation to our big environmental challenges.
No matter who we are, no matter what we're doing, whether you're an academic or you're just, a biker or you're a lawyer or you cook food in a food truck, how are we going to, like you said, how are we going to intersect what we're up to or what we're passionate about, and how we can, direct that, put that in a trajectory of making the world a better place. And what I think is beautiful too, so I'm not so sure I was like 100% aware of that you were a square peg trying to get into a circle or whatever we said when you were teaching back there. But I have to say, those have kind of always been my favorite teachers, and I've been a teacher myself, and I think I was kind of like that too, It made me realize, leaving also the teaching world, and maybe you felt this too, is that you can still teach, you can still educate in a way that you don't necessarily need to be in a 4-wall classroom or even teaching a class. As a tour guide, I feel like sometimes you're a teacher on a bike, just going around teaching people things. And I think, and so I think there's, lots of different ways to teach, and through writing and all kinds of stuff like that. So really at the end of the day, it's just, how do you want to communicate your message? And that's what you do. You talk a lot about using adventure as a way to communicate environmental issues. So what do you think particularly is about adventure translates this so well?
Yeah, good question. I mean, people love having adventures, right? But they also love hearing about them. And that's the thing. I mean, the fact that people love hearing about other people's adventures is a fantastic hook. So there's an awful lot written about environmental issues, and climate change has probably got more graphs associated with it per square inch than any other topic on the planet. And a lot of it is dry and difficult to access. And So it's been an interesting question for me. I remember once hearing a poem that talked about the pity for poor scientists who know about this climate change stuff and how horrifying it is actually, and are trying to scream this message using statistics, and how difficult it is to scream with statistics. Right, that was the point. So I've been really thinking for a long time about, well, how do you communicate this stuff in a way that engages and that really reaches people? And I'm not saying the only way to do it is to embed it in an adventure story, but I think it's our way to do it. So with the carbon cycle, as you know, I cycled from Texas to Alaska, mostly following the spine of the Rockies, and just explored the American culture, the fractions of it that I met on this journey in relation to what people were thinking about climate change and talking about it, and also what solutions were coming out of the belly of the oil beast. Because where the problem is biggest, for example, in a country like the United States, which is heavily dependent on oil, you're also going to get the best solutions. And that's definitely the case with the United States, and to an extent with Canada too, I would say. So it was this sort of combination of a personal adventure, the chance to ride my bike in beautiful mountains, which is one of the things I love to do best, combined with, talking to people about climate change and doing some research, and then trying to put the whole thing together when I got back into a slideshow that would reach a different set of people that would come because of the bike adventure and then learn about the climate change, people that perhaps wouldn't go to a straight lecture labeled climate change. That was the concept. And then eventually, I got the book published. And writing the book was, of course, a much harder challenge than riding the Rockies, I would say. And it seemed to work. I mean, 10 years later, I was still being asked to give the Carbon Cycle slideshow in loads of different places. I could still be giving the Carbon Cycle slideshow had I not moved to a different adventure. So I just thought that's really interesting. People like that combination.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, for anybody out there listening, I highly recommend picking up this book maybe before the next book comes out, which we'll talk about shortly. I just got finished reading the Carbon Cycle for the second time now, and it is such an adventure. But I have to say, it had that impact on me because my favorite kinds of books really are these like journeys or like diaries, documentaries of people from everything from building a house to sailing a boat around the world. I love these, but I'm not just saying this because you're a guest on my show right now. This is one of my favorites because it has a point. It's like you said, it's an adventure plus. It has a greater, good. So I highly recommend everybody check out this book because I really enjoyed it. And maybe it was also kind of fun because I actually knew some of the characters in the book. And it takes place in the United States as you go all the way from Mexico to all the way up through Canada and then up to Alaska.
I sometimes think that travel writing is almost cheating as a writer, because if you take notes and you put yourself in the way of encounters, you're going to end up with some interesting material. And as you'll know from the Carbon Cycle book, it's basically a series of anecdotes about the people I met and talked to and the landscapes I cycled through. It's just interesting stuff. Like, the people who are staying in RV sites will have something to say about climate change that you could never have made up yourself, but will be a novel insight that you would just not have thought of. And likewise, the people that I met in truck stops and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hope that comes across in the writing as well, that sort of sense of, we don't have to study climate change in a way that makes us feel half dead.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, if you're a person like me who loves to go on journeys or even if you're somebody out there that dreams about going on journeys and at the same time you're concerned about climate change, it's the perfect combination. I was just curious a little bit, about your writing process. Just in short, how do you collect all the notes and how do you turn it into a book afterwards?
So with the Carbon Cycle, I actually wrote longhand in journals, as in spiral bound journals. And I was terrified of losing them.
Deal.
I have a really bad memory. And anyway, even with a good memory, there's no way you'll remember the detail of all of those conversations and all of those landscapes and all of those places. And so every night I would be writing that journal night after night after night. And I came back with like a stack of, I think it was 10 journals. And then I sat down with those
Wow.
journals and initially more or less just wrote them up, and then
Mm.
strengthened the climate change story and tidied them up and edited them and so on. So
When I always try to write in a journal a lot of time, but then you kind of get distracted by all these other things going on your adventure. But I mean, do you find it easier when you have the intention to actually write a book?
yeah, I mean, it's necessary for me anyway. There's
Yeah,
no way I could write a book about a journey if I hadn't kept journal notes throughout
of
that
course.
journey.
Yeah.
I mean, people do. I know of people who have written their books about their journeys without keeping detailed notes, but I can't do it that way. So for me, that's absolutely the foundation. And then there's almost like there's two stages in that, because the journal is just scribbly longhand stuff, and then if you post blogs about it as you go on your way, the blog by definition means that you have to kind of process a bit and summarize and turn it into a bit more of a narrative. So that's one stage towards some material that's going to be more book shaped in the end, rather than just this splurge of details and facts about what you've been up to. So the blog is a really useful sort of step in that process. And on the more recent journey, I actually took a laptop and wrote straight into the laptop. So that in some ways is very time saving, because now all the stuff is already in an electronic format. In other ways, it's not time saving because well, the carbon cycle was 3 months, right? You can more or less write up your journal notes for 3 months and it's kind of book shaped. But the life cycle journey was 13 months of cycling and a year and a half of traveling. And if you write that up as a journal, it would be 10 volumes and really, really boring. So although all the notes are electronic, there's a huge process then of editing and summarizing, and it's a very different process.
So when you were on this trip, you met a lot of people along the way, but you traveled alone most of the time, like most of the trip, or at least about half the trip. What do you think about traveling alone versus traveling with other people? What changes in that dynamic?
So with the carbon cycle, I traveled first half entirely on my own, and then Chris, my partner, came out for the second half. And it was so interesting. I mean, the thing about turning up on your own as a woman on a bicycle with panniers, it's miraculous, right? As soon as Chris was there, that didn't happen. When people perceive you as traveling within a couple, they treat you very differently than what they do when they perceive you as traveling on your own. And that was really clear. So the first half of the carbon cycle, anytime I would stop somewhere, there would be people all over, surrounding me, asking me questions, often giving me water or offering to buy me food, or, just super, super kindness that you get the world over towards travelers, particularly travelers on their own. When I was with Chris and we stopped on our bikes, very rarely would that kind of interaction happen. So that was really, really interesting. The downside of traveling on your own is that, I actually love traveling on my own. I really, really like it. Sometimes though, it can feel quite heavy in the sense that every single decision you're making on your own, and there's no one to check things against or talk stuff through with, and likewise, there's no one to say, "Wow, look at that! Isn't that amazing?" And sharing the experience in the fact that you're journaling and you know that journal eventually is going to become a book, but you're not sharing that experience in the moment with another person. So that's the huge plus of having somebody else with you. I love traveling on my own, and also I find it easy. This is going to sound daft, but on the life cycle journey in particular, the most recent one, I was really busy. So I was cycling a lot of hours in the day because it was a long way, obviously, from North to South America. And I was, in the evenings, I would be setting up project visits, so loads of stuff on email to try and sort out the next place I was going to visit. I was keeping my journal. I was trying to write blogs. Occasionally I was writing short articles. And I was also trying to study Spanish. And I was also trying to read stuff and do research. So by the time you've ridden your bike for, let's say, 9-10 hours a day, and then sorted out somewhere to sleep and sorted out somewhere to eat, and then kept your journal up to date, and then started to work on a blog, and then done maybe 15-20 emails and done some research on the projects that lie ahead, there's no way you have time in all of that to go out to dinner with a partner or, be sociable. Mm-hmm. So actually traveling alone is really, really straightforward. You just do what you have to do. You don't have to negotiate. When do we stop? When do we eat? When do we start? Is it okay for me to spend the entire evening working? You just do that stuff and a whole lot of complications disappear. So that's a sort of a weird, perhaps slightly unexpected positive about cycling alone, on top of which, as I say, I just actually really, really like it. And then when your partner does join you or a friend or whatever, there's a huge bonus because suddenly you can say, wow, look at that, isn't this amazing? Or shit, should we go this way or this way? I really can't decide. And you've got somebody there to talk stuff through. So.
Yeah, it's a fair overview. I think, both kind of particular situations have their own pluses and minuses. And yeah, as you say, it's been very busy while you're on these trips. The first trip, the carbon cycle, you were focusing on the issue of climate change. You're reading all these notes, all these blogs. You're talking to all these people. At the same time, something that I noticed that you struggled with a bit is this kind of idea that, I'm passing by all these towns, but I just got to keep going. I want to stop here. There's all these amazing things happening. I mean, at that time, you were kind of in a rush a little bit. You had 3 months to get across North America. How do you feel about that on a trip? Do you ever wish, do you ever alter it in the future to give yourself more time or?
It's a really weird dynamic that I think it's almost inevitable if you have a journey with a time limit on it. Like I was still employed in those days, so that was the amount of time I had before I was due back at work. And it was a good amount of time, but I really wanted to get to Anchorage, Alaska. So you've got a deadline in terms of time and a destination and a certain amount of miles to do between the two. And there's something about the dynamics of that kind of seems to mean that inevitably you end up running short of time. And I ended up on the carbon cycle, as you know from the book, and this cliche of a race to a finish ending where I was beasting it, just doing ridiculous, hundreds of miles a day to try to get there on time. And it was ridiculous. And I would be cycling past places where people would say, just go down that road for a mile and you'll see grizzly bears pulling fish straight out of the river. And I'd be like, no, I can't stop. I have to keep going. And it was just so ridiculous and so frustrating. But I could not bring myself to say, I'm going to quit before I get to Alaska. It's fine. It doesn't matter. I won't go to Anchorage. I'll stop before I get to Anchorage and just spend more time here. Because I had said, I'm going to go to Anchorage and that's the finish. In my head, I had to get to Anchorage. And I still haven't quite worked out the psychology of that. Because I sat on my sofa one day years before planning this journey and said, it starts here and it ends there. Then that became this trap that I felt compelled to cycle myself into exhaustion and past all these amazing things. And so for the life cycle journey, which was the length of South America, the other thing to say about the carbon cycle journey is that it was based on a 75 mile a day cycling average with, I think, a week off a month in terms of days, or there was a certain number of days off per month anyway. And then in between 75 miles a day. And that's a reasonably ambitious cycling average, but it's not impossible by any means. However, it turns out there's not a lot of leeway for headwinds if you're trying to do 75 miles a day and stop and talk to people. So I was perhaps slightly ambitious in terms of the mileage. So with the life cycle journey, I figured out roughly how long I thought it was going to take, and then I doubled the time. And I still ended up in a rush because it's that inevitability, as I say, there's something about having a set distance and a set time that creates tension and that creates a lack of time, especially towards the end of the journey. So weirdly, I ended up in the same race to the finish. Cliched ending in the life cycle as I did in the carbon cycle, even though I had vowed never, ever, ever to do that again.
You spoiled the ending of the book now. I was wondering about this. I was thinking, will Kate slow down?
I did to start with. Definitely I did to start with.
That's really funny, actually. Okay. Yeah, because that's something that I've dealt with. I mean, every single bike trip or hitchhiking or hiking trip, I'm always like, next time I'm going to give myself more time. I mean, do you ever just dream of going on kind of a trip with no end?
Yeah. I think that's the way to do it, just to say, I'm going to cycle out of the door and I'm going to see where I get to and not have a destination in mind. Either that or not have a time limit. I think you need one or the other. But as I say, if you've got a destination and a time limit, then you're going to end up with stress.
It's always a race to the finish.
Yeah.
Your partner, Chris, who in the book and also in real life, was kind of commenting, oh, you're just acting out this adventure narrative that's embedded in your soul.
Yeah. And he didn't suffer from it at all. He was like, well, let's just stop here. It's lovely. We can spend a week just hanging out. And I mean, I suppose, to be slightly fair on myself, because I was trying to use the adventure as the communication medium, there was an element of, right, the adventure is, there's this woman trying to cycle the length of the Rockies. Will she make it? It's no longer an adventure if it becomes, well, and then they stopped and had a holiday, right? So I think the power of the adventure narrative would have genuinely been weakened had I stopped halfway up the Cassio Highway and just ate pizza and hung out. Nevertheless, I think there has to be a more creative way of defining adventure than having to have a race.
It is interesting. Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I had a kind of an experience when I was in Scotland. And I remember this is when we were doing an assignment in actually one of Chris's classes, and we had to go on a journey. And I remember I was like, I have to get to the top of Ben Nevis. Like, this is my goal. And I got there. It was November. I was like, I'm going to camp. And there's no camping allowed. It's freezing outside. There's ice forming around the tent. It's raining. Everybody in town was like, no, don't go there. It's going to be white out on the top. And there was this moment where I was like, I'm enacting this adventure. I'm acting out this adventure narrative right now. And to be honest, I went back to the hostel in town, met some nice people, had some beers in the pub, and it was great. And it was a bit of a moment where I was like, actually, this was much better than doing that. but I don't know. I don't know if that's as adventurous sounding. But it was a different adventure, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a different, it is kind of like, that is this like breaking down of like what adventure means, you know, it can mean something different to everybody, but it doesn't have to mean one thing, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to talk a little bit about your other big adventure, where you know the first big adventure in the carbon cycle through North America was very much focused on climate change, but this new one that's coming out, the life cycle, unreleased as of yet but coming out soon, is about biodiversity. So why, first of all, give us a little just sense. You've teased a little bit beforehand, but where this took place, for how long, and why biodiversity in this case?
So the adventure bit of the life cycle journey was cycling from the north of South America. So I started in Colombia and cycled more or less down the Andes on road. This was an on-road, and sometimes they were off-road roads, but they were roads, cycling down the length of the Andes, more or less, to the end of South America. And the Andes, Amazing. Of course, is the longest mountain chain in the world. So for a mountain lover, it was just a fantastic, fantastic journey. And the environmental focus was biodiversity loss. And the reason I wanted to focus on biodiversity loss is because, well, it's happening at a catastrophic rate. I mean, we are losing other species and populations of species and habitats at a rate that has been called the sixth great extinction. It's happening, so fast that it has been described as the sixth great extinction. And this extinction is being caused for the first time ever in Earth's history by a resident species, namely ourselves. And the results of the sixth mass extinction promise to be every bit as catastrophic as climate change, but the whole issue gets far less press. So if you just think about pollinators, for example, we are all solar powered. We actually run on the sun's energy, but we can't access that directly. We need plants and other beings with green chlorophyll to do that, to turn sun's energy into carbohydrates. And many, many plants need pollinators, and pollinators are crashing. Their numbers are in decline all over the world. We literally cannot survive without pollinators and the other kind of forms of biodiversity that give us fertile soil, clean air, the habitats that take up carbon, that create oxygen, and so on and so forth. So biodiversity is not a luxury. It's not a nice to have. It's our life support system. And yet we're destroying it at this incredible rate. And we hardly talk about it, or we didn't until David Attenborough released his latest film series. Excuse me. So I wanted to really tackle that and to do something that would help raise awareness of biodiversity loss as an issue, and also to explore what the responses and the positive solutions would be.
What about biodiversity in South America? Like, what kind of stuff did you see and experience and find out down there?
So, I mean, South America, biodiversity is relevant everywhere, right? This isn't an issue that only affects South America, obviously. We all need biodiversity and we're losing it globally. But South America is an amazing country, amazing continent to travel if you're interested in biodiversity, partly because it's got such an astonishing diversity of habitats and species there. So biodiversity refers to habitats as well as species. I started on the Caribbean coast, and the habitats I went through included deserts and the high spiky white mountains of the Peruvian Andes, and Paramo, which are kind of wet and full of these incredible massive bromeliad plants, the salt flats, I mean, all sorts of habitats that were just mind-blowingly amazing. And of course, forests, cloud forests and rainforests and tropical dry forests, all sorts of different kinds of forests. So the diversity was right there in front of me, which is an incredible thing to cycle through the topic that you're exploring. But also, South America it's like a continent on a tipping point. It has this extraordinary diversity of species and habitats, but it also has just huge industrialization, massive extractivist industries. The oil industry has been trashing the Amazon rainforest for a very long time now. You've got massive impacts from gold mining, copper mining, lead mining, etc., etc. And you've also still got a lot of poverty. So, for example, in northern Colombia, where I started, there are some fantastic forests which are being taken down by local people who need to do that in order to grow food to farm, and that was the only option that they had. And then the other end of the extreme, obviously, is parts of the Amazon where the deforestation is being driven by very, very wealthy corporates that are taking down the forest in order to grow soy to feed to cattle, etc. And it's big, big money involved. So I just learned a shed load of stuff about A, how important the issue is, and B, what the different drivers are, everything from poverty to globalized capitalism, basically, and C, that we've got to tackle it, and there are many, many win-wins in the way that we can tackle it.
When you were biking through South America, I mean, who did you visit, or I mean, how did you relate your visits? I'm assuming you visited different projects and stuff down there.
Yeah, absolutely. I visited all sorts of different projects. So everything from a monkey conservation project in northern Colombia that was trying to protect monkeys by protecting the forest. But the way they were doing that was to tackle this poverty issue that I mentioned. And they had a particularly brilliant scheme. They're called Proyecto Titi in Spanish, Project Titi. And the titi is a cotton-top tamarin monkey, which is tiny. It's like a pint-sized little creature. And they're endemic to that part of Colombia and extremely threatened because their habitat is extremely threatened. And that's a part of the world where the habitat, the forests are being taken down by local people primarily because they have no option. And so Project Titi was working with the local people to collect waste plastic in an area where there was no rubbish collection, let alone any recycling, and then turn that plastic into flakes. And then they had this brilliant process where they could turn the flaked plastic into fence posts and other things that the local communities could then sell for enough money so that they wouldn't need to cut down any more forests. So it was just a brilliant win-win-win project, and basically tackling monkey conservation by tackling poverty and sustainable rural development. So that was one example. I visited a school whose entire curriculum was based on turtles. That was an amazing example. I visited a small fishing community that was trying to protect the local fishing industry from big industrialized Chinese trawlers. I visited all sorts of, as you would imagine, habitat protection, habitat preservation type projects again, almost always working with the local community to protect forests or protect a paramo, whatever it was. And then the visit that really kind of opened my eyes to a whole new set of issues were some anti-gold mining activists, also in Colombia. I had no idea about gold mining before I went to South America, but it turns out it's a very, very environmentally damaging process. So mercury, as you know, is used to extract gold from the soil. And then when mercury gets into the water and ecosystems, it's extremely toxic. And all sorts of other heavy metals get acidified and dissolved into the water supply as well in the process of extracting gold from the earth. You have to move about a ton of earth in order to get less than a gram of gold. So it's a very, very destructive process.
Crazy.
And the gold mining companies are incredibly powerful, and they have been known to shoot people who get in the way of them and who try to protect their landscapes. So this was a huge eye-opening kind of journey for me, really, because until I had gone on this journey, I didn't know the story of environmental defenders, and that this is very well documented work that the Guardian newspaper has done in conjunction with an organisation called Global Witness, and they're looking at people who have been killed all over the world in defence of their communities and their ecosystems. And I encountered examples of this on my journey. So the projects I visited were a huge range, as they say, from really small scale local preservation and environmental protection projects right up to people trying to tackle corporate capitalism and the worst excesses of that, which you see in the gold mining industry or in the oil industry in the Amazon rainforest, for example. I mean, taking down Amazon rainforest to extract oil is literally insane from a climate change and biodiversity and indigenous people perspective. So it was an eye-opener of a journey, and also very fabulous because of the places I was cycling through and the really inspiring people I was meeting. And now I have the much bigger challenge, having cycled the length of the Andes, of putting it all together in some coherent form in a book that people will want to read. Yeah. And I haven't mentioned the bike. The bike, of course, was another special feature of this journey.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, tell us a little bit about like how you prepared for this and the gear that you took along with you. I mean, I'm a bit curious about your bike, and then also kind of, at least for probably a lot of people are thinking this, but I'm thinking this because I'm thinking about doing a South America trip myself. Yeah, like how did you ride and where'd you stay? You know?
So the best bit about this journey in a way was the bike. I built the bike myself out of bamboo. Ooh. And so that was an adventure in its own right, because I've never built a bike before. But so I went to the Bamboo Bicycle Club in London, and they run courses of how to build a bike out of bamboo. And the bamboo came from the Eden Project in Cornwall. So the bike is called Woody, and Woody, we think, is the UK's first homegrown bicycle. And the most amazing thing about the journey was that Woody lasted the whole way and was actually the most reliable bike I've ever owned. So that was an incredible part of the story. And again, a huge positive. I mean, turn up on a loaded bike by yourself, that's one thing. But if you turn up on a bamboo bike, oh my goodness, you have no problem meeting people. You're a
celebrity.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm curious, so why bamboo?
Well, I wanted to build the bike myself. I thought that would be add a really interesting dimension to the journey, and would also help me look after the bike on the road. I mean, if you've built the bike yourself, you kind of know how it works, right? That was the theory anyway. But more importantly, it's a lovely kind of symbol of low impact. So bamboo is a very, very fast growing plant. It grows in Cornwall without any sort of difficulty whatsoever. And it sequesters a lot of carbon, more than your average tree, in the course of its growth. So you end up with a very environmentally low impact bicycle. Not that bicycles are hugely high environmental impact anyway, but steel or aluminium does have a carbon footprint, obviously, because of the heat involved, apart from anything else, in creating steel or aluminium. So it was a kind of like a symbol of a low environmental impact bike, given that a bike is already a relatively low environmental impact machine. And there just felt something really coherent about being on a biodiversity bike ride on a bike that used to be a plant. I mean, it just, the medium and the message seem to be nicely integrated because of the bike.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And it lasted the whole, I mean, it was over a year that you traveled through jungles and mountains and deserts, and
with a lot of
that's
luggage.
incredible.
Yeah.
And just curious about like some logistics. Like, I mean, I guess you stayed in a number of different kinds of places, but I mean, were you outside most of the time camping, or are you staying indoors? Like, how did that work out?
For Colombia and Ecuador, there isn't really a camping culture. And I was a bit nervous about wild camping at that point. I mean, these are quite populated countries. It's quite hard to find secreted places, or I thought it was at that point. Anyway, for Colombia and Ecuador, I had my tent with me, but I was mostly in hostels or cheap hotels. And I was on the Pan American Highway a lot, so it's really easy to get cheap rooms behind gas stations that the truck drivers use. And they're great. They're clean and anonymous, and they have Wi-Fi. And so yeah. And then as I got into Peru, I started using the tent more and more. And by the end of the journey, I was just living in the tent. The thing about the tent that I would recommend to anybody is I got a freestanding tent, which means that once you put the poles into the tent, it's tent shaped, and it doesn't need pegs to make it tent shaped, if that makes sense. And what that means is that you can pitch on concrete or the verandas of nature conservation organizations, or on really soft sand, or on really hard snow, or on rock, or you can put your tent anywhere basically. And that was a huge, huge bonus. I slept in that tent in some very random places that would have been very difficult to get a normal tent up if you needed to have tent pegs to give the tent its tent shape. So that would be my top tip: get a self-standing tent.
Yeah, no bivvying. Yeah.
No, there's a lot of insects in South America that like to munch sweaty cyclists. So I kind of liked having the tent, and also the tent gives you a certain amount of privacy, doesn't it? That nobody knows what's in there on the outside. So I always felt really safe in my little tent.
Yeah, I have to say, coming from, I'm originally from Florida, which has quite a similar, I would say, biodiversity to, it's tropical. So it was a lot of places in South America. And I remember when I first came to the UK to study there, and we were just in bivvies all the time. And I was like, what is this? We would never do this in Florida. You get snakes crawling in and stuff. But up in the UK and these like Northern European countries, it's kind of fairy tale animals. So you don't have to worry so much.
That was interesting too, thinking of animals that you have to worry about. So, yeah, there's a certain amount of snakes and insects, but not actually a huge amount. I never had any great problem with them. But the massive bonus of being in a tent in South America as opposed to North America is you don't have to worry about bears. So when I was camping on the carbon cycle, particularly as I got further north, you have to be so careful, as you know, about taking all your food out of your tent and putting it in a bear hang and not having anything like even deodorant or soap in your tent, anything kind of odorous with you that might attract a bear. In South America, I could sit and eat sugar pops in my tent, and it just wasn't an issue because they do have big animals, but they aren't the kind of big animals that go to tents. So that made life a lot easier.
Oh, it sounds like the dream. You're talking about the biking dream right now. This is amazing. A few other quick journey questions. Okay, North America versus South America. Food. Did you have a preference?
Well, I'm vegetarian, so yeah, it depends. There are bits of North America which are still, well, they were in 2006, terrible from a vegetarian point of view. Like, I had a lot of really, really bad veggie burgers in parts of northern Canada. And that may be that the vegetarian food culture has improved since I was there. Other bits of North America are fabulous. I mean, anywhere you can get Tex-Mex type food with beans and eggs and rice and veg and potatoes, wonderful. And the same with South America. I mean, where I was living in my tent and buying vegetables from markets, that's fantastic. You've got a huge diversity of vegetables and fabulous foods. Where I was eating out of truck stop cafes, not so good. It's not really a vegetarian culture. And whereas South America, when I was there in 1992, beans and rice was the main meal more or less everywhere. That's now become chicken and rice or chicken and chips. So I ate a lot of eggs in South America. There was a time when I was eating nine eggs a day with rice or chips, and that can't be good in a long-term basis, I don't think. I have some very un-vegetarian friendly food. Like there's a bit of Peru where the only thing they seem to eat is guinea pig, and guinea pig and chips is not really a very vegetarian friendly meal.
Yeah. I do remember when I was in South America for a couple months, I was eating, that's where I overdosed on eggs. I think that's when I became vegan after that. just because I had too many eggs.
Well, as I say, if you buy your food fresh from the local markets, then it's fantastic. Like when I was cooking for myself in my tent, and I'm not a great cook by any means, but just to be able to cook up some fresh veg and pasta and sauce, it was a much, much, much better food than in the truck stop cafes as a vegetarian.
Yeah. And so you were there for over a year in South America. And how does it work out with, for example, like carbon footprint? Because I remember I think the last time I saw you some years ago, you were talking about, I have my you have like a carbon budget and you don't want to fly too much. So how did that work out when getting to and from South America?
So for the carbon cycle, I flew across the Atlantic for it. And at the time I justified it and said, well, I'm going for 3 months and I'm going to be cycling when I get there and I'm doing it for a good reason. And then, believe it or not, it took me quite a while before I spotted that this was exactly the kind of thinking that was the problem. Like, so my attitude was, well, my flight's okay. I can fly. I'm special. My journey is special. And when I realized the depth of my own hypocrisy on the carbon cycle, I was like, okay, I have to do something about this now. And so what I decided was I didn't feel ready to say I'm never going to fly again, but I would put myself on a flight ration. So since 2006, I've not flown more than once every 3 years to that. And actually, it's been a real plus. So when I do fly, I really make the most of it. And I absolutely, love it. So last year was a flying year in my world. Or maybe it was the year before last. I'm losing track. Anyway, the last time I flew, I went to the Banff Mountain Festival. I was giving a talk there and I took part in their writers course and I visited lots of friends in Canada. So I really, really made the most of my flight, but then I won't fly for another 3 years. So on the life cycle, it wasn't a flying year and I wanted to do the whole thing without flying anyway. So I actually crossed the Atlantic on a cargo ship there and back.
Wow.
And that was also an amazing part of the journey. I absolutely loved it. And it greatly reduced my carbon footprint from about 2 tons for a transatlantic flight to about 50 kilograms for a per passenger mile cargo ship journey across the Atlantic.
That's so cool. Wow. I've always wanted to do that. How long did that take?
It took about 11 days on the way out and a month on the way back because I picked it up much further down the Pacific coast of South America on the way back. So we came up through the Pacific coast from Santiago and then through the Panama Canal and then across the Atlantic.
Whoa.
So it was a long old journey.
Amazing. Yeah. I could do a whole podcast just asking you about the cargo ship. We'll save that for next time. But how did you arrange to get on a cargo ship? There's
a broker called thecruisepeople.com or .co.uk, cruisepeople.co.uk. Don't be deceived by the name. It's not a cruise. It's very comfortable. You get an ensuite cabin and 3 quite bad meals a day if you're a vegetarian, but nonetheless there is food, and that's it. There is no entertainment whatsoever, except that you're on this amazing ship and you can hang about and watch flying fish all day. It's wonderful. But yeah, it's not like the old days where you could just hitch a ride on a cargo ship. You have to do it through these official brokers, and they set up the relationship between you and the cargo ship that's doing the journey that's closest to the journey that you want to make. You have to have fantastic levels of insurance because they have no medics on board at all. So you have to be insured to be helivaced off if you had a heart attack, for example, or something that required hospitalization. So, yeah. It's not like
amazing,
but it's still a fantastic, fantastic way to travel. Really interesting. There's a whole world out there. People live on these ships for months and months and months on end. And it's huge. 90% of everything we own, apparently, at some point in its life will have been on a cargo ship. So there's this vast world of stuff going around the world that we don't usually even think about, or I don't. Anyway.
That sounds like a whole book right there. The ship cycle. All right. So I see our time is fleeting here. So I'm gonna wrap it up soon. But I just wanted to get your take on a couple of things before we get out of here. What I think is amazing about using adventure as a way to communicate is like, this is another vehicle for environmental communication, communicating about the environment. At least in your first book, you talked a lot about, for example, Fox News and how they were kind of the main propagator of a lot of misinformation about the environment and, well, a lot of things in life. But then on the other hand, I think it was in The Guardian a couple months ago, or maybe like a year ago, where I think they started using the term like climate emergency instead of climate change. So they're trying to be more progressive about things. What do you think these days about the like level of public environmental communication? Do you think it's improved at all, like since back in 2006 when you were on the carbon cycle?
I think it's improved. I think it's improved massively. It definitely has in the UK. So in 2006, the BBC still had this policy where, in the name of balance, if they were interviewing a climate change scientist, let's say, they would also interview a climate change skeptic. And many of us within the environmental movement were saying this isn't balanced, because actually, 98% of climate change scientists are convinced climate change is happening. So if you present an interview as if there's a 50-50 split, here's somebody who thinks climate change is happening, here's somebody who thinks it isn't, it doesn't actually represent what is actually the case in terms of what the majority of people think. So the BBC has in fact changed its policy on that now, and they do not give airtime to climate change skeptics any longer, because they accept that the overwhelming majority of scientists and others are convinced that climate change is happening and that it's real, that it is now, and in fact an emergency. So that's been a huge, huge step forward. Having said that, as you will know, one of Extinction Rebellion's big asks is that we tell the truth. And there are a lot of people in the UK and around the world who are outraged at how little attention the mainstream media is still giving to the climate change and the ecological emergencies. And of course, when you look into it, our media is still dominated by an elite few, at least in terms of the newspaper presses. So I think it's still it's a really important question and a really live debate. There has been huge improvement, but there's a long way to go yet.
Indeed, yeah, and that's why we're here on the Transnational Perspectives podcast, to get the word out on the environment as much as we possibly can. And thank you so much, Kate, for coming on today and giving us some time in your transnational perspectives about your journeys. And could you just give us a little bit of information about where people can find you and find your older books and maybe your newer book coming out?
Sure. So the best way to find me is on my website, which is www.outdoorphilosophy, all one word, .co.uk. So outdoorphilosophy.co.uk. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Carbon Cycle Kate. There's information about the carbon cycle on the website. That book is actually quite hard to get now, but you can still get secondhand copies in some places. It had two publishers, neither of which exist any longer, through no fault of its own. But the new book, The Life Cycle, will be coming out in the spring with Icon Books. I'm super excited to be working with them as a publisher. They've been absolutely fantastic so far. So look out for The Life Cycle in the spring.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Like I said, I'm a big fan of your writing and your teachings. And actually, I have a signed copy of The Carbon Cycle. So maybe we'll have to have an auction here on the podcast one day. We can talk after the show. Like, what would be a price point for this? For environmental causes, of course.
And many publishers out there who'd like to republish The Carbon Cycle. It's about to be a hit again when The Life Cycle comes out. So it's also looking for a new home.
Indeed. Amazing. Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to catch up with you after all this time, and I look forward to reading your book, and I hope we can get you on again sometime to talk about some more environmental communication, adventure communication issues around the world. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Josh. It's been really good to catch up with you too, and thank you for your interesting and stimulating questions.
Welcome back, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with adventurer plus Dr. Kate Rawles. I know I did, and I think it was just quite an honor, as it is with all of our guests, to talk to amazing people like Dr. Kate Rawles. Don't forget, everybody, to check out all the information about her journeys and books, where you can find her talking next time we can meet in person or perhaps online at her website, outdoorphilosophy.co.uk, or also on Twitter at Carbon Cycle Kate. I know in the post show we were talking a little bit, and not to reveal to get anybody's hopes up, but there is supposedly some kind of bike book tour in the future, so I look forward to that. And if you can, maybe you can even make it over here to Norway. That would be amazing. I have to say, it was personally super neat to be able to talk with Kate after reading her book. A bit surreal, actually, to talk to the character in the book. I highly recommend her previous book, The Carbon Cycle, if you can get your hands on a copy. Like I said, I have one. If you're in the area, let me know. And just stay tuned to Kate's website and her Twitter to learn more about her new book. It's coming out soon, The Life Cycle. And like I said, it's coming out on Icon Books shortly. So if you can, possibly give your local bookstore a ring. See if they can order it for you, pre-order. It's always good to go local when you can. On a reflective note, Kate's journey is something that really resonates with me. And maybe you too. I think many of us want to go out there and quote unquote save the world, but it can seem really overwhelming. So many ways you can contribute, right? And which is the right way for me? Now, personally, I've always dreamed of going on big journeys with a purpose, like Kate does. And I'm a person that I love to move, I love to camp, I love to be outside. And in fact, that was kind of the original intention of this podcast. Let's see what happens post-pandemic. Maybe things are changing, but one thing I have realized in making this podcast and talking to people like Kate is that we don't need to go on big, long journeys to spread our message. In fact, here we are connecting right now, sharing this message. And where are we really? Somewhere transmitting our message in many ways. It can be very accessible, even more accessible than ever, really, than right now that we've kind of reduced a lot of the hoopla and pomp and circumstance of what it used to be to teach a course or have a meeting. We can do it on a bike. You can do it in a virtual classroom. You can do it in a boardroom. You can do it in a Zoom meeting. You can do it in your neighborhood, or you can even spread your message right here on our headphones. So, as I usually say, let's attack from all sides, everybody. Let's make it happen. On that note, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and I invite you to reach out to the show and let me know what you think. Do you have any questions about today's topic? Any questions for Kate? Any ideas for a future episode? Let me know, please. And don't forget to support the show by sharing this episode, subscribing to the podcast, and rate us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It's super helpful. And if you can, please consider supporting the show via our Patreon or other methods. All information about this and more can be found on our website, transnaturalperspectives.com. And that's it, everybody. These are the Transnatural Perspectives for today. Until next time, get outside and get some perspective.